I didn't expect to see him again after 32 years, and I certainly didn't expect him to recognize me from a necklace I'd worn since I was 29. My name is Elizabeth. I'm 62 now. I live alone in a small apartment in Brooklyn where the radiator hums like a tired heartbeat, and the lavender soap I use can't quite cover the smell of time passing too slowly. I never married. People always asked why. I told them I'd chosen to care for my mother. That was only half the truth. The other half was a man named Mark who disappeared from my life when I was 30, taking every dream I'd allowed myself to imagine with him. When I was younger, I used to go to the library during my lunch hour, not to read, just to feel less invisible. Mark worked there. He had kind eyes and a voice that made me believe I mattered. We started with small talk about books I'd never read and weather that didn't really matter. Then one October afternoon, he asked me to dinner. I said yes. I wore the silver locket my father gave me before he passed. That was the beginning of the only 6 months of my life I can still feel in my chest when I close my eyes. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. We met every Saturday. He brought flowers from the corner stand, always daisies because I'd mentioned them once. I baked small things, lemon cookies, blueberry muffins that never rose quite right. We'd walk through Prospect Park and talk about lives we wanted but hadn't yet built. He dreamed of a house upstate with a porch. I dreamed of a garden where I could grow tomatoes that tasted like summer. My mother never asked about him, but I felt her watching me when I came home late, humming while I folded laundry, smiling at nothing. Her silence weighed more than questions ever could. Mark asked me to marry him in the spring. We were sitting on a bench near the water. The air smelled like rain and fresh grass. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My hands shook when he slipped the ring on my finger. I told my mother that evening. She was sitting in her chair by the window, knitting something shapeless. She didn't look up. Her needles kept moving. Click, click, click. Steady and cold as winter. She asked when. I said we hadn't decided yet. She nodded once. Then she said she was tired and wanted to rest. 2 weeks later, Mark stopped answering my calls. He didn't come to the library. I went to his apartment. The landlord said he'd moved out without leaving an address. No note. No explanation. No goodbye. I waited for months. I checked the mailbox every single day, hoping for something. A letter, a postcard, anything that would make sense of the silence. I walked past the library during my lunch hour. I looked through the window every time, hoping I'd see him. I never did. Eventually, I stopped looking. I folded the memory away and turned my attention to my mother. Her knees were failing. Her hands trembled when she poured tea. She needed help getting dressed in the mornings. What he said next made the air leave my lungs in a way I hadn't felt in decades. She needed me, or maybe I needed to be needed. I stayed. I cared for her through the long years, meals, appointments, and quiet evenings when she couldn't see well enough to read. I became the daughter she'd always wanted me to be. The years passed slowly. My friends married, had children, built lives I could only watch from a distance. They stopped inviting me places after a while. I didn't blame them. I'd become the woman who always said no, the woman who was always needed somewhere else. My mother died 10 years ago, quietly in the same room where I'd grown up. I held her hand until the very end. She whispered something I couldn't hear. I told her I loved her. She closed her eyes. After the funeral, the apartment felt both too big and too small. I stayed with her things and our old routines because I didn't yet know who I was without them. Last Tuesday, I went to a small cafe near Prospect Park. I don't usually go there, but the morning felt different. The air was cool and the light had that soft amber quality that reminds you autumn is coming whether you're ready or not. I ordered tea and sat by the window. I was looking at my phone when I heard someone say my name. I looked up. A man was standing near my table. His hair was gray. His face had lines I didn't remember, but his eyes were exactly the same. He quietly said my name again, almost as if he wasn't sure it was really me. I couldn't speak. My heart felt like it was pushing against my ribs, trying to break through. He glanced down at my chest. The necklace hung just above the collar of my sweater. He noticed the locket resting against my sweater and whispered that he remembered it. Surprised, I still wore it. I touched it without thinking. My fingers were shaking. He asked if he could sit. I nodded because words wouldn't come. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He looked down at his hands. I looked at the steam rising from my tea. Then he began to explain. He didn't ask for forgiveness first. He didn't make excuses. He just told me what happened, piece by piece, like he'd been rehearsing it for 32 years. He said my mother came to see him 3 days after he proposed. She told him I was all she had. She said if I married him and left, she'd be alone. She said her health was failing and she was afraid. She asked him to leave quietly, to let me believe he'd chosen to go, to let me think it was his decision, not hers, so I wouldn't blame her. She told him I was devoted to her, that I'd never forgive myself if something happened to her because I'd chosen him over her. She told him the kindest thing he could do was disappear. He said he didn't want to. He said he argued. He told her we could find a way, that I could care for her and still have my own life. But she wouldn't hear it. She told him he didn't understand what it meant to be alone at the end of your life. She told him he was young and would find someone else. She told him I wouldn't. So he left. He did what she asked. I sat there, staring at him. My mother had done this. I didn't know my mother's closet still held pieces of my stolen life. She'd taken my future and folded it away like an old letter I was never meant to read. He kept talking. He built a quiet life upstate. Marriage, 2 daughters, then years later, a loss that left him alone again. He said he thought about me sometimes, especially in the spring when the air smelled like rain. He said he wondered if I'd gotten married, if I was happy, if I ever thought about him. He said he almost looked for me a dozen times, but he always stopped himself because he didn't know if I'd want to see him. He didn't know if I'd forgiven him for leaving. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but my body felt too heavy for tears. I told him I never blamed him. I told him I thought he'd simply changed his mind. I told him I spent years wondering what I'd done wrong. He reached across the table. He touched my hand for just a moment. Then he pulled back. He gave me his number. He said he'd like to see me again if I was willing. He said he wasn't asking for anything, just a chance to know me again. Then he stood up, smiled in a way that made my chest ache and left. I walked home in a daze, hardly noticing the streets. When I stepped inside, everything looked unchanged, yet something in me had shifted. I went to the closet where I kept my mother's things. I hadn't touched most of it since she died. I opened the boxes she left behind, old clothes, familiar scents, quiet reminders of her. Beneath them, tucked away almost shyly, was a small wooden box. It was plain, unvarnished, the kind of box you'd use to store receipts or old keys. I opened it. The letters were his attempt to reach me, pages of regret, hope, and explanations he'd never been able to say out loud. Each one carried the same ache. He never wanted to leave. There were at least a dozen of them, tied with a thin piece of string. They were addressed to me, but the envelopes had never been opened. The return address was Mark's old apartment, the one he'd lived in 32 years ago. The handwriting on that envelope made my entire body go still. I sat on the floor. I untied the string with clumsy fingers. The knot didn't want to give. I opened the first letter. It was dated 2 weeks after he disappeared. The handwriting was neat, careful, like he'd taken his time with every single word. The last letter in the stack was different. It wasn't from Mark. It was from her. The envelope was smaller. The paper inside was thin and fragile. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were painfully clear. It was dated 1 year before she died. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been afraid of being alone, afraid of losing the only person who had ever stayed. She said she'd told herself she was protecting me, keeping me safe from a man who might leave, who might hurt me. But she knew now she'd been protecting herself. She said she hoped I would understand. She said she hoped I would forgive her. But she also said she understood if I couldn't. She said she'd hidden the letters because she couldn't bear to destroy them, but she couldn't bear to give them to me either. She said she loved me. She said she was sorry. She said those two things over and over in different ways, as if saying them enough times would somehow make them true. I held the letter. Something cracked open inside me. Not anger, not quite sadness. Something older and deeper. Something I didn't have a name for. Only then did I understand what she'd carried in silence all those years. He answered on the second ring. We met at the same cafe. This time, the conversation felt easier. We talked about our lives, the years we'd lost, the people we'd become. He told me about his daughters, about the house he'd built upstate, about the quiet life he'd lived. I told him about my mother, about the routines I'd kept, about the loneliness I'd learned to carry like an extra coat I couldn't take off, to see if there was still something between us that could grow. I told him I didn't know yet. I told him I needed time to sort through what I'd learned, to figure out how to hold all of it without letting it crush me. He said he understood. He said he'd wait as long as I needed. Later that week, I went back to my mother's grave. I brought the letter she'd written. I didn't read it out loud. I just stood there, holding it, letting the wind move through the trees around me. I thought about forgiveness, how it never erases the hurt, only softens the space around it. Mark and I have been seeing each other once a week now. We take walks through the park. We sit in cafes and talk about small things. We share silences that feel comfortable instead of heavy. It's not the love we had at 30. It's quieter now, slower, marked by everything we've lived through. He's patient. He doesn't push. He lets me move at my own pace. I think about the girl I was, the woman I became, and the choices, mine and others, that brought me here. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if Mark and I will build something lasting, or if this is just a gentle closing of an old chapter. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive my mother, or if forgiveness is even the right word for what I'm trying to do. But I do know this. I'm no longer living in the narrow hallway of someone else's life. I'm standing in my own doorway now, looking out, deciding where I want to go. And some days, that feels like enough. But last night, I opened the locket I've worn for 32 years. Inside was the faded photo of my father, and tucked behind it, so small I'd never noticed, a tiny folded note in my mother's handwriting. It said, "Forgive me for loving you the only way I knew how." If this were your life, would you forgive her?